very pleased to have joining us a special guest, a representative of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Seoul, Ms. Signe Poulsen. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me here.
Well, we have a lot to talk about, and I think a lot of our listeners, both here in Korea and maybe even around the world, know about the plight of these separated families. Can you just give us a sense, though, how urgent do you think it is that we do have a reunion sooner rather than later?
It's extremely urgent. It's extremely urgent. Of course, as you alluded to already, there are now some 59,000 persons on the list in South Korea of people who wish to be reunited with their relatives on the other side of the border. And many of them, the majority of them, are above the age of 80. And they've been waiting for years and decades to be reunited with their loved ones. Some of them thought they would only be separated for a few days, or they were going on a trip. And 60 years later, they are still waiting for each other. So there is an urgency. In addition to that, there's also a need for involving a greater number. So the reunions that have taken place so far have been great, but yet we have so many people who haven't had a chance. So the number who've actually been reunited with their families is a very small percentage of those who wish to be so. So the frequency, the numbers, all of those are urgent.
And it's if you've seen archive footages of reunions in the past and this very, very heart-wrenching kind of emotional outbreak that you see when these brothers and sisters and moms and dads and sons and daughters all come together, not having seen each other for decades, you know that the human element is we would like to see this happen more and more often, maybe on a bigger scale. However, for these families, there are factors that are beyond their control, whether it is North Korea and whatever provocation they may endure, the hawkish or relatively dovish stances by whether the South Korean government at that time, whoever's in charge, and also, of course, with the United States and these other wider regional factors. It does make it a very difficult time, especially what we're seeing with these overarching Northeast Asia tensions right now with North Korea and its nuclear weapons program, right?
It's difficult, but I think when we talk about such fundamental human rights as your family, as being allowed to see your brother or your son, it's important to take it down to the individual level. There's no person who can object to such a fundamental thing. I mean, especially in Korea, but around the world, I think there is no culture where family doesn't have a particular meaning, whether you are North Korean or South Korean or from another part of the world. I think, some of the people I've spoken to, and I spoke to a man who was able to meet his son for the first time in I think actually for the first time ever. And all he wanted was to spend time with his son, but he had this one family reunion where he was able to meet and talk, and now he's living out his old days here in South Korea without any possibility of follow-up. And it's truly unimaginable, I think, for those of us who haven't gone through it. So there are also other things we want in connection with these family reunions, and maybe we're asking for a lot, but it doesn't seem like a lot. Things like after you've met, to be able to retain some kind of contact through post, through phone, or even through meeting again. Things like being able to meet privately and not under the media. I mean, media actually has played a very positive role in pushing these reunions forward, but at the same time also to have some time at least to meet privately and to understand what's happening with your relatives. So these are all things we are advocating very strongly for.
And it is unfortunate, because you mentioned those logistical issues. There's been talk in the past of having some kind of phone conversation or video chatting technique. But as you say, a one-off meeting, certainly from the human perspective, is certainly not enough. You mentioned human rights being a fundamental part of these family members being given a chance to once again see each other again. I want to shift the discussion then slightly over to human rights as a whole in North Korea, because the United Nations in 2015, they established the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights here in Seoul. The mission, among many things, to monitor and document human rights issues in North Korea. Can you just talk about your organization's work and what's been taking place so far?
Yeah, so far. So we were established here again by the Human Rights Council of the United Nations because there had been a finding by a commission of inquiry that crimes against humanity on the balance of probability was taking place. And so when you talk about crimes of that scale, it becomes more than a national sort of sovereignty issue. It becomes actually of concern to the entire international community because the crimes are so horrific and so widespread and so systematic. So we've been established, first of all, to monitor the situation and also, where possible, to work with civil society to raise awareness of what the actual situation in North Korea is, and to provide the United Nations also with information in that regard.
Many people often ask in regards to it, and I suppose you hear that skepticism as well as, well, if North Korea is always obstinate and they are completely an opaque regime and they never cooperate on any matters like this, they won't even publicly acknowledge that there's even a slight problem with human rights. How important is it that North Korea, even to a minimal extent, is somewhat cooperative?
It's extremely important. And while that will not solve every problem immediately, I think we also have to exercise some humility and some patience in this regard. And so last year, for example, we saw North Korea present its reports to a committee on women and a committee on children on human rights. And they went to Geneva, they wrote a state report. It doesn't mean that we have the full picture of what's happening to women and children, nor does it mean that everyone's life is dramatically improved, because certainly many women and men and children in North Korea live a hard life. But having that dialogue and starting to have that discussion is a very important way of starting to get information into North Korea that might not otherwise be there, even if it only gets to a small part of the North Korean population.
As a member of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and a large focus of it being the human rights situation in North Korea, I imagine in your purview, of course, this is a very important issue. But as you monitor South Korean media, as you monitor international media coverage on the Korean Peninsula, we know that often it is overshadowed by these wider geopolitical security concerns, whether it's development of nuclear weapons, whether it's talk about North Korea becoming more provocative, and now I suppose the specter of the U.S. and how they might shift policy in a much more drastic manner towards this peninsula. That being said, you still see pockets of coverage coming from time to time, whether it's a book being published by a defector, someone who's escaped the gulags, and as you mentioned, the Commission of Inquiry, where that very heart-wrenching and very, very explicit as well as disturbing testimony that we heard from various defectors. Do you feel that your job in terms of raising awareness and trying to get people to focus on, as we acknowledge, it's very important to be concerned about nuclear weapons and all that, that it is somewhat of an uphill task to try to make people aware that this is just as important, if not more important?
It can be, of course, although I do feel that in South Korea, there's always been quite a lot of awareness, but perhaps outside and globally, there is a great recognition these days that there is a very serious human rights problem. Now, I don't think the United Nations can take the whole credit for that. I very much want to hand over credit also to the civil society organizations in South Korea, to the media, and of course to people who've come from North Korea themselves, who've bravely come out and sometimes at very great risk and told their stories. So I think together we are managing to make inroads on that. But one of the reasons it's so important, we think, is for there to be any peace or to resolve this nuclear issue or other provocative issue. What our ultimate goal is is for people in North Korea to be able to live their lives, freely and with dignity and with all those rights that we take for granted, and enough food and education, and to make choices about their own lives. And so a peace without those aspects of peace, it's not really a peace in some ways. Yeah. And that's why, that goes all the way back to the founders of the United Nations, who recognized that development and peace and security and human rights go hand in hand.
Can't have one without the other, and I suppose often, sometimes perhaps we forget that when these other pressing matters overshadow things. We do hope that certainly there is more awareness, and as you say, a wider effort is being made to shine light on this. We're going to have to leave it there, but Ms. Poulsen, thank you so much for joining us. We really learned a lot, and we hope you have a great time in your stay in Seoul. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.